Good afternoon, Kingdom Come. Uh, this is the day that the Lord has made. We will still choose to rejoice and be glad in it. Hope you all had a good week. I am coming off the high of yesterday, where I'm excited to say we had our first Zoom new membership course. In light of and in spite of what 2020 is giving us in pandemics and continued civil unrest, God still brings growth. And so I am just overjoyed. And in the words of Freddie Haynes, peacock proud, honeymoon happy, that we are still growing and going. With that, I'm not going to hold us too long. I'm going to go into the sermon. But before I do that, I do need to share about the reminder of this week will be our regional biennial gatherings. And I will be sending out information in text regarding where to register and what website. And if you want to go on the website yourself right now, hit pause and go to abcrgr.com and look up biennial. As I shared earlier, it's a two-part gathering, two-part biennial, where this first week we will be addressing the COVID pandemic. Next week we'll be addressing our racial justice pandemic, or our racism in society. So just know that. And as new members were not able to, join us for our Zoom membership class, do not be discouraged. I'm going to reach out this week to see if we can get those new members who were not able to make it on with us all the same, and see where God takes us. All right, now let's get into it. Without further ado, if you have your Bibles with you, I'm going to go to the Old Testament of First Chronicles, chapter 21, First Chronicles, chapter 21. We're going to be starting at verse 1, but First Chronicles, chapter 21. First Chronicles, chapter 21. And we're going to assess and reassess and continue to examine around this concept of leadership, and more specifically, God's judgment. And so with that, I will be reading these words. First Chronicles chapter 21, starting at verse 1. These words faithfully recorded. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So David said to Joab, and the commanders of the army, "Go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, and bring me a report so that I may know their number." But Joab said, "May the Lord increase the number of his people 100-fold. Are they not my lord, the king, all of them my lord's servants? Why then should my lord require this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel?" But the king's words prevailed against Joab. So Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came back to Jerusalem. Joab gave the total count of the people to David. In all Israel, there were 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and in Judah, 470,000 who drew the sword. But he did not include Levi and Benjamin tribes in the numbering, for the king's command was abhorrent to Joab. But God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to move to verse 11. Verse 11 picks it up, and that is, so Gad came to David and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, take your choice months of devastation by your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or 3 days of the sword of, excuse me, take your choice. Verse 12, either 3 years of famine or 3 months of devastation by your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtake you, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, pestilence on the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now decide what answer I shall return to one who is sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but let me not fall into human hands. A title we can tag upon this text, a subject we can connect to this sermon or thought is, this all could have been avoided. This all could have been avoided. The book of Chronicles highlights the idea and concept of chronicles, basically being a chronicler, which suggests documentation, giving dates, giving times, giving moments of highlight within the life and the people of God, most specifically Israel. And in this text, we see where David is in leadership. A couple of chapters previously, we will find his predecessor, Saul, has been killed in military action. And now the full reign of Israel is on him. He just came out of, and his men just came out of another war, most specifically with relatives, families, or tribes in connection with Goliath. So in our childhood stories, we often heard of David fighting this giant by the name of Goliath. Well, Goliath got some cousins, Goliath got some brothers, and the like, and they were at war again, and they won that war. Now, all of a sudden, and where we've come to our text is where David has been asked to trust God again. Prior to every war David went into, David knew he had confidence in his military and had confidence in God and how he would fight battles. But it was at this moment, for some odd reason, David decides to do a census or count his numbers, count his military numbers before going into war again. And so we now find David, who is highly established, but is taking up on this crazy thing called corruption. He's been known as a good leader. And if you go in the book of Acts and you read about David, it highlights David as one who was a man after God's own heart. But here we have this man after God's own heart who's not trusting God. Wow, consider that. You have a man after God's own heart who's not believing in God. And he's questioning God, so much so he's disregarding God. Not to say questioning God is wrong, but it is wrong to question in essence, it is wrong to question the existence of God when you have had a relationship with God. Does that make sense? Let's further unpack this thing in what is happening with David. And so with David being established, we've learned now David is corrupt because he's counting men in his army when in essence he had confidence in his army and confidence in his God, but as he moved about and going about his leadership. Which leads me to my first point. First point is, don't get so comfortable over being content. Nothing wrong with being content, and arguably nothing wrong with being comfortable. But let us not be so comfortable where we decide to be driven by our fear, our anxieties, our greed, our ego, or our legacy of what we may think we're trying to preserve. And so we have David here who has gotten so comfortable in leading people and serving people, it's about to cost him the expense of innocent people dying and passing away because he chose comfort over being content. The second point, David ignored consciousness or conscience, which sometimes goes against common sense and convention. As we have established, David being a man after God's own heart, as we have established, David was an established individual. He's good. The Israeli Empire is the Palestinian Israeli Empire is doing okay. Things are peaceful, even if they're not calm in David's context. But here we see David abandoning conscience, and he's deciding to exercise common sense where it's not so common. And he's also abiding and following in convention. One of the challenges in being a Christian in this mystery we call life and on this journey we call faith is sometimes we need to listen to conscience over what is conventional wisdom, over what is common sense, simply because that's what we need in leadership in order to avoid some traps that we may fall into or pitfalls that we may find ourselves in. Not to say common sense is not good, not to say following convention does not have its space. As a matter of fact, as I reflect upon my situation, upon my life personally, I was just talking to my wife this morning, and one of the challenges we navigated and were talking through was, what would it look like after I had experienced my personal divorce if I went home and stayed with my parents out of that experience after experiencing a divorce? And what I had come to learn was two things. One, I could not fully prove to myself how I wanted to be the man God had called me to be, but further, I would have fallen into comfort when I needed to be pushed out of my comfort zone. Are you all with me today? That's what I mean when I say we have to we may have to listen to conscience over common sense or what's comfortable or conventional. And so for me, it was the fact that God called me to stay here in California. God called me to continue to serve in spite of where I was in that space and place. And God kept me through it all. That's what I love about conscience, is the fact that we can avoid some mistakes or go through some things having conscience over comfort and convention. And here we see in our text, David has ignored conscience and he's choosing comfort and convention. But not only do we see David choosing comfort over being content, not only do we see David ignoring consciousness over common sense and convention, but also David ignores intelligence. That really should be a start and a sign for any kind of leadership we decide to succumb to or find ourselves under, or just as much as find ourselves in. How much does the leadership pay attention to intelligence, which should give you indication on where you're trying to go? We're in this election season, we're in campaign seasons, and one of the challenges that I have with both political candidates that's seeking the position of leadership for our respective country is the fact they're both negating intelligence when it comes to policy. And so what is happening, back to this text, is where David is ignoring his military intelligence. What's amazing is his chief of staff, his military joint chiefs of staff, they're all giving David information and intelligence about how to move about their country because of how this thing has worked in the past and it's working out. Joab, who's considered one of the joint chiefs of staff, is telling President David that you need to not count or do a census and just follow through with what you have been doing because this has been a military success. And he did not want, the joint chief of staff did not want President David to ignore intelligence. And now here where we are, where I got to verse 11, that now that David has gone against this, and against God and against Joab's intelligence, now he has to suffer the consequences. And oftentimes in life, we may confuse consequences or even God's consequences as God's judgment. And I'm here today to tell you that God's judgment has never been about consequences. God's judgment has often and always been about God's warning. This is just one indication about how God works in this thing we call the universe and our Christian faith. Had David heeded to intelligence, that was God's judgment. But because David did not follow the intelligence of his chief of staff, Joab, now he has to deal with the consequences. And the consequences, God is saying and suggesting, you got three choices, which one choice, you can go with the judgment of nature, be it pestilence, be it famine, be it humanity, where you can deal with that judgment or you can deal with my judgment. Now, what I love in this text is that third choice that God gave to David, where he states, and I'll read, or 3 days, his last 3 days, 3 days of the sword of the Lord, pestilence on the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. Now decide what answer I shall return to the one who sent me. David said, I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but let me not fall into human hands. Notice the consequence, the choice of consequence that David had was to accept the sword of the Lord. But notice David's response in saying, give me the hand of God. The choice of consequence was the sword of the Lord, but David said, no, give me the hand of God. Why is the hand of God important? Because the hand of God in the midst of consequence contains and sustains us with mercy. It contains and sustains us with grace. It contains and sustains us with forgiveness. It contains and maintains us with God's goodness in spite of the consequences. And what I love about David is David, as a leader, takes responsibility. God, deliver me from folk who don't want to be led by leadership, or where we have leadership that doesn't want to take responsibility for their actions. That's what our lesson suggests today when we talk about how things could be avoided. Things can be avoided when we take God's judgment and not have to deal with consequences. That's my best shot. God bless you. Look forward to seeing everyone next week. And as I shared before, I'll be in touch. God bless you, for we are citizens of the kingdom, serving as citizens in the world.